This is Questions of Courage, a podcast from the youth section at the Goetheanum, hosted by Nathaniel Williams.
Welcome to Questions of Courage. Today I'd like to focus on a burning issue, tense area of our moment, and as is naturally often the case, when intends to do something like that, it can be really difficult to offer a contribution and offer perspectives or thoughts that generate more light than heat. And I think that's particularly the case today, speaking about nationalism and the nation state. Now, if we do manage to look at things from a new perspective, one of the first things that occurs to us is how much we are guided by habits of thought and how much unconscious judgment, how many unconscious assumptions we have. Things that we take just as self-evident and totally clear that are not self-evident and totally clear, and that can be seen from really, really different perspectives. And I'd like to try to offer one. And the situation and reality of the events that are being, will be related to these ideas are so complicated and so also, intense. It's definitely not offering anything but a humble contribution and trying to think about things in a different way. However, one that I sincerely am inspired by and that I think contains great potential. I mean, when we look at my own country, where I come from, the United States, there's been a turn towards a conscious embrace of nationalism by many of the people that are currently in positions of power in the United States. Slogans like America First, Make America Great Again. There's a really strong focus on the national identity and really focusing on the importance of fighting and working for the interests of that national identity. I mean, if we look towards the Middle East and the horrors which are currently unfolding moment to moment, particularly focused in Palestine, but of course in Lebanon and Israel and Iran now, there is a spread of, the worst violence, the most modern technologies of war at work. And these questions of nationalism, of the nation state, of course, are particularly relevant also to what is happening there, though by no means a significant way of understanding what's happening right now there. But first of all, I want to just characterize one of the things that I think a lot of people feel is totally self-evident, and talk a little bit about a time when it wasn't as clear. I mean, if we think back, for instance, to the founding of the United States at the end of the 18th century, this is when there was a war that was fought between a group of colonies, particularly English-speaking colonies, and their home country in England. And there was a creation of a constitution, and there was the establishment of a feeling of a nation or a people that were a community connected to this constitution. We the people, famous phrase in the English language in the United States, for its political resonance in relationship to the history of the United States. And, when we use the word nation and we use the word state in English, and now I'm speaking, of course, from my own experience as well, which I can only do, there's a lot of obscurity about any differences between nation and state. And often people in the English language will use nation and state somewhat interchangeably. But when we look, for instance, at the idea of a nation, one way to look at a nation is a group of people that share a language, have some shared history, and that, through the language and that they share together, there's certain ways of looking at things, of understanding things that they're given, that they relate to, that they grow up in. Of course, many people are multilingual, particularly here in Europe where I live. But, when we think about growing up with a predominant language, it really gives you a kind of cultural horizon for your experience as a human being. Is so important, and that really reaches into some of your most intimate experiences, what you achieve through language. On the other hand, a state before the modern period, let's say before, for instance, the United States was founded, but also other modern states in the Americas, it was not necessarily connected to nationhood. It was connected, or the experience of a people, it was connected to, for instance, dynastic rule. It was connected to families. And within these great states, for instance, there were many nations. And nations, of course, when we think about linguistic groups, they're not located in one territory or one place. They can be spread out all over the world. And indeed, when we look back before the modern state, the state was really not associated with nationness or nationalism. And it's interesting because with the United States, we have this emergence of an experience of nationhood through the creation of a state, a people. And we have then, as the modern state develops, a tendency to connect the modern state with nationhood. And so we have nation states. And indeed, over the last 100 years, there have been, this understanding of a state as a proper vehicle for a cultural group, a linguistic group. It is very widespread. And when we look at the states that are founded and how they're founded and the kind of imaginations that they're informed by, this is what many people think about when they think about states. So here there's a kind of fusion of the experience of being a part of a people and being a part of a state that's taking place. And, if we think this through to its conclusion, it can start to seem really absurd. I mean, if we really intend to uphold the idea that ultimately national groups need to have states in order to really come to themselves, in order for them to really be autonomous nations, they need states. There are 6,000 linguistic groups, and they're not located in different distinct regions. They're not like 6,000 groups of people living in particular areas. They're totally intermixed, different places of the world. And imagine the idea that somehow, ultimately, we wanted to work towards all of them having their own nation, connected with a state, connected with a sovereign territory. I mean, it can immediately become an absurd imagination. What we would see would be like a real process of fragmentation, just obviously reflecting on what's happening in the Middle East right now. Think about the strife related to territory, related to having a sovereign territory for your nation state. It's implicit in this way of thinking, where we fuse the nation and the destiny of nations to have states. And here I'd like to introduce an idea from Rudolf Steiner's social thought. And this is really the perspective that I'd like to offer as a complement or a counter perspective on what I think are a lot of just unconscious assumptions that we live with. One of the things Rudolf Steiner suggested was that really language groups, national cultural groups, should be really seen like scientific associations or cultural associations. It's like it's your deep connection with a particular cultural reality that you can associate with freely culturally. And that there should be a separation of nations from states. And he makes this comparison that really nations should be seen like special interest scientific associations in his book, Towards Social Renewal. And one of his suggestions is that one of the primary causes for conflicts between language groups and nations is that there isn't a sufficient separation of nations, not only from the state, but also from economic enterprise and economic processes and decisions. And he really suggests that what is going to be important to try to imagine and live with national identity in a way that it's not fused with political institutions or economic enterprise and cooperation. And this, in a way, allows us to picture, for instance, one side of the problem, right? Because then we can picture our belonging to a people as a national identity, as a cultural reality, as being a kind of free association that is not, contained in a particular territory, that is not regulated and have to be contained with a certain constitution, but that is really not confined by those conditions. But then what about the state? And this is where his observations and suggestions about this are really pertinent for places where democracy has taken root. And it wouldn't be fair to suggest these are valid all over the world. I think, for instance, particularly where there are monarchies, obviously this has almost a very limited significance. But in the places where democracy has developed democratic values, democratic practices, and aspirations, Rudolf Steiner suggested that the state really was connected with that way of relating together. And with people being able to vote on rights and duties and things that could be voted on in a way that everyone could participate in the vote. Now, anyone who has drafted legislation or tried to suggest legislation that can be looked at from a democratic perspective knows this brings with it a whole host of challenges. And it really limits what you can consider in this way. And some of the examples Rudolf Steiner was very clear about was the regulation of working conditions, of working hours, of everyone having an equal vote, and establishing certain agreements that had to do with the rights. And this is a whole area in political theory. I'm not going to go into it more, but of course we know from a perspective of like Rousseau, this is something that was of special interest to him, someone who Rudolf Steiner was very critical of. But the question of what you can work with in a context of equality is connected to the state for Rudolf Steiner. And so then we could imagine, for instance, a state that could encompass many nations and where the things that are voted on and which are suggested as legislations have to do with questions of equality in significance and also with participation of everyone being able to vote on them to establish them. So this is, very rudimentary sketch of the separation of nation from state, trying to imagine what this could look like. A rights state and national cultures, nations as predominantly as cultural associations, we could even say, even though that sounds like a probably somewhat degraded way of characterizing it. Maybe it's also helpful in this context to just say that. One other thing that I think it's important to look at, now I've already mentioned Rudolf Steiner suggested that conflict, one of the roots of conflict between language groups and nations was connected with the unconscious fusing of national identity with political institutions, economic enterprise, and cooperation. And there's another view on this which we see coming out of the United States from the earliest period of its history, and that's with a piece of legislation that was written by Thomas Jefferson. And Thomas Jefferson authored an act for establishing religious freedom in 1779. It was passed as part of the Virginia Constitution in the year of 1786. And it went on to become one of the most influential pieces of legislation in the United States at that time. And it has to do with the separation of the church from the state. Now, we've been talking about the separation of nation from state, and Jefferson had written a legislative law that had to do with separating the church from the state. Now, one of the things that I think we think about immediately today when we think about the separation of church from state is that it allows for freedom of the individual. So we really focus on our own freedom that's achieved by separating religion and spirituality from the state. So if the state is separated from religion and spirituality, then it can't dictate to me what I believe and what I think. It's interesting when you read the legislation itself that the argumentation that makes up what I think is the heart of it is actually that if you fuse the church and the state, you will degrade the church. You will degrade spirituality. So it's not so much a libertarian argument of don't tell me what to do and I want liberty, but he focuses more on creating conditions where the greatest possible potential of spiritual and religious life could thrive. And for him, if it was connected to the state, those certainly weren't the case. And this was his argument. If you have a minister or a pastor who's working in a church, which existed at this time, where their salary is guaranteed by the state, their relationship to their community and their relationship to the people that they're meeting and that they're also helping or offering spiritual or religious advice to changes. His point was, just consider, for instance, someone who might be looking for a profession and know that if they can get a minister status in a public church, that their salary is pretty much guaranteed. It's obvious from the argument that Thomas Jefferson makes is what you're doing there is you're just enticing people who actually have no business or no inner calling, vocational calling to be active in spiritual or religious life, to look for a vocation there. And in the end, you have a kind of corrupting influence on religious life because you end up with people whose participation in religious life is really inspired by financial security and perhaps status, and not really by the, let's say, respect of the community that is voluntary and spontaneous based on what one is trying to do. So his argument was religious and spiritual activity should really be supported by voluntary gifts and spontaneous community efforts to create their own spiritual religious life. And by creating those conditions, by separating the church and the state, we protect religion and spiritual life. So this is one of the arguments in this piece of legislation. And it's interesting because when we now look at nation and state instead of church and state, and this idea that separating nation and state is a conceivable way to think about collective action and life in the future, this would suggest we could see the fusing of national culture, language with the state as a corrupting constitution. That in the end, if we continue to not be able to differentiate between the two and to see and experience our nationhood through the state, that in the end, this leads to a corruption of the gifts, of the potential, of the greatest alignment with what is potentially given through a national culture. So there's a corrupting influence on the culture itself, on the nation itself, that we could consider is really set in motion when it's connected with state power. So there's these two perspectives. One, that nations identifying with political constitutions and states and also economic enterprise and cooperation leads to the conflict between national and language groups. And the other one is that it also corrupts, it actually degrades national culture and language groups' spiritual identity itself. So these are two perspectives that really stand in stark contrast to where we started. Because we started with this assumption that so many people live with. One, there's no separation between nation and state. And two, there's a feeling like nations somehow should have their own states and they should have sovereign territories as a vehicle for their national identity. But now we've come to a perspective where we can see that actually the possibility of the fusion of the nation with the state could be connected with the corruption of the culture of the nation. And I think that anyone who pays attention to language and thought and sees what happens to language and thought and certain cultural treasures, spiritual treasures of different nations, when it is appropriated by states, instrumentalized by states, used by states in the form of nationalistic propaganda, this degradation can become very evident. And it's these thoughts that I wanted to unfold today, just very brief, obviously extremely humble characterization in light of the challenges, but at the same time, from thoughts and like these, they also can be seen as seeds that can contain so much that sometimes can't be predicted. And I personally wanted to share this because I feel like this imagination of the separation of nations from states is connected with violence, but also the degradation of language and culture in the way I've just described. I offer that in this time where this issue is such a burning, contested question. Just want to offer that as a contribution of, one, becoming self-aware of some of our assumptions, but also through looking at things from through a new lens. Questions of Courage is a project of the youth section. It's a collaboration with the communication teams at the Goethe Annum. The production costs are very low, but the Goethe Annum is really only possible because generations of people who have given and who have volunteered and who have striven because they feel like the goals of the Goethe Annum are worth supporting, are worthwhile. And I would like to invite you to consider making a contribution. These are freely available, these podcasts, but anything that you make as a contribution to the youth section will go into youth work, and it is needed and it is appreciated. And thank you for joining us again.